HBTV. I'm Harry Binswanger, the HB in HBTV. Welcome to the first day of spring. And that's true wherever you are around the world. It's the vernal equinox, when the axis of the Earth's rotation doesn't make a difference to the sunlight falling upon the Earth. It's about vertical. More on that as it develops, but let's go to the questions. There's a lot of questions. A lot of them are very hard, but I hope I can answer most of them today. I might have to spill over to another time. First question, as the West declines and mysticism / tribalism are on the rise, will we see more nationalistic wars like the ones started by Putin? You bet. Will they be minor and largely pathetic, or will there be another world war? Well, I don't think any wars are pathetic, but I do not think there'll be another world war, but you can't know, you can't predict. The reason why I don't think there'll be another world war is that it's too conceptual for the present fragmented state of society, for one thing, and the risks are too high for another. So, for instance, people are worried that Putin would use some kind of horrible nuclear weapons, and I don't think he can. I think if he gave the order, launch the missiles on Europe, let's say, for a nuclear strike, his generals simply wouldn't obey him. So he might use a tactical weapon in the field, which would just be like a big TNT bomb. It wouldn't be a big deal, but it would scare a lot of people. But I don't think he's in a position where he can make nuclear war on the world. Were the 1950s a more sane time? Were people more rational with a better sense of life? It seems like the general population back then had higher standards of behavior. Yes, I grew up in the 50s. I know the 50s extremely well. In 1950, I was 6, and in 1960, I was 16. I turned 16. So I grew up in that time. I know what they were like. And the 1950s really extends until 1964, strange to say. It was in 1964 that Goldwater got trounced. The left felt it had control, and the new left started its cycle of violence, and there were riots and there were burnings in cities, and reason was pushed off the stage entirely. But as to the 50s, there was a downside. It was impossible to be very dramatic back. They were a repressed era, just as you've heard. Everybody wanted to forget World War II. Maybe not everybody, but a lot of people wanted to forget World War II and live a, quote, normal life. So it was an era in which people were not open to black and white thinking too much, but they were able to engage in thinking. So, for instance, 3 or 4 of my friends from that period, and I'm not talking about a wide circle of people, I'm talking about maybe out of 20 people, are friendly to objectivism, if not objectivists. So that you wouldn't find out of a selection of young people today. But there's a more telling statistic. Religion was dead in the 1950s. I didn't know anyone in my community growing up who was actually religious. Well, I mean, you could push that, but religion became very strong in the late 60s. And Reagan, of course, brought it into politics, endorsed it, even though he wasn't particularly religious himself. And people in college, uneducated people, I'm sure the people in the backwoods were as religious as they are now, but educated people didn't go to church. They didn't pay attention to religion, and the ideas of religion were not taken seriously. And that's why when Ayn Rand said, she's asked, "Are you an atheist?" And she said, "Of course," at the first lecture I heard from her. That was not shocking. That was just, yeah, I guess she's educated. She can think. She's not superstitious. It's like asking, back then it was asking, do you believe that breaking a mirror brings 7 years of bad luck? No, of course not. Now, I don't want to overplay it, but it seems that religion was a much less strong factor, much less, among educated people then than it is now. And the number of people who were willing to think about issues and discuss ideas was much higher in the United States than it is now. So now it's just two tribes screaming at each other. But the old left was an intellectual movement. The old right was a Cracker Barrel movement. So the intellect was on the left, and the left was in charge. You know, the right was receding even then, and Goldwater's defeat just put the nail in the coffin. So, and I use right to mean roughly pro-capitalist, pro-America, pro-freedom. So, yeah, it was a better time. And if you look at the movies from the 50s and even into the 60s, you see a lot more people with integrity. Integrity was a theme back then, but there's no such thing as that now, because integrity means loyalty to principles. So High Noon, for example, where Gary Cooper played a sheriff who could have turned and run out of town. The town people wouldn't stand up for him, but he thought his job required that he take on the gang that was coming to kill him. And In the Heat of the Night, 1969 was the last one like that. 12 Angry Men was about one juror who's able to turn his fellow juror members around by nothing but reason and logic. So Judgment at Nuremberg, 1964, something in the earliest 60s, was a terrific story about standing up to the Nazis and being a man of principle when all the temptation was to compromise. So yes, it was better because contemporary philosophy had not completely destroyed the educational system and people's ability to think. Progressive education was really rare in the 50s. What is your evaluation of Ron DeSantis and Trump's likelihood of actually becoming the nominee again? You're asking the wrong guy. I never thought Trump would get even the nomination. I thought in 2016, I thought his nomination was a joke. I mean, his candidacy for the nomination was a joke, and the campaign would last about 2 weeks. Ron DeSantis, there's a lot bad about him. He's in a campaign now to have the government impose ideology in the schools, in the colleges. Now, the ideology he happens to be opposing is terrible, but you don't fight a bad ideology with laws saying that they can't hire or teach that kind of idea. You fight it with better ideas. He also is one of these conservatives who thinks that big tech is the enemy. He thinks that big tech, you know, Facebook and social media and so forth, but all big tech has too much power. Yeah, power to make you happy, power to make your life better, power to create values, to offer you values, most of it for free. Political power is the power of the gun. That's the power that we want to rein in. Only government can censor. Facebook has a right of free speech, which includes the right not to promote ideas they disagree with. So that's very bad. But I think the worst thing recently is he's courting Trump supporters by saying good things or mealy-mouthed things about Russia and how we shouldn't support the Ukraine. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but he came out just a few days ago with the statement that distanced himself from support for Ukraine. And obviously he's courting Trump supporters that way. On the plus side, he was very good in the way he ran the COVID thing in Florida. He was on the side of more freedom. And we opened up here a year and a half before they opened up in New York or California, if they've ever opened up. And nothing happened. He was right. The statistics for Florida are the same as the statistics for the surrounding states that had a stricter regime. So he was right on that. But boy, if you're not on the side of free speech and you're soft on Russia, I can't support it. Can you talk about the Objectivist Forum? Now, the Objectivist Forum, I have in a collected form here in front of me. I couldn't find any of the actual original issues. The journal I had from 1980 to 1988 that was appealing to Ayn Rand's audience and had her support. She wrote to the readers of the Objectivist Forum for the first issue, recommending it in a somewhat, careful, qualified way, but still recommending it. She gave me her mailing list for the Objectivist, for the Ayn Rand letter, which was 11,000 people at the time, and included some interesting names like Ray Bradbury, the science fiction writer, was on the, got the Ayn Rand letter. Anyway, she was getting to know me on a very personal level at that time, as opposed to just seeing me as one of a number of students of Objectivism who were also philosophy graduate students. I think, yeah, I got my degree, my PhD in 1973, but when we first met, I was an undergraduate. So she saw my development and she was willing to take a risk that I would do okay as editor and publisher of the periodical, the 16-page periodical that I put out. And she served as, the title was philosophic consultant. Our arrangement was that for articles that I wrote, I would actually show them to her in advance, for her to approve them in the sense of not thinking they were a betrayal of her philosophy and that they were decent articles. The articles by other people that she thought wouldn't carry as much weight, since it's not their magazine, but I'm publishing mine as a kind of almost editorial. The articles of other authors, she asked me to show a title and a brief description of what they were going to do in advance, but she didn't have to read the articles. So I was warned by a man who left Objectivism shortly thereafter that she would be impossible to work with, that she wouldn't let out articles, that you couldn't please her, that she was irascible, and I was making a big mistake by giving her this authority. Didn't happen. There was one article that I wrote, which she very nicely thought told me was not up to snuff, and I needed to rewrite. And so I ran something else and I rewrote the article. And the rewritten article was my most popular piece. I really profited by her input as to what needed to be fixed in it. So other than that, she liked everything she saw, and there was no problem whatsoever. It turned out it was the other guy's problem. This guy who left objectivism didn't understand it enough to know what she would approve of and what she wouldn't. So the other interesting comment she made was, I wrote an article on anarchism. You can read an expanded version of it at hbletter.com in the blog. I refuted anarchism, including the argument, which was current then, that if you're against monopoly, you have to be against monopoly government. And we need to put government on the market where we'll have the benefits of competition. There was specifically one little argument that had not been raised previously about monopoly is bad. And so I wrote an article refuting that, and I showed it to her in galleys, typeset, and she read it, and her comment was, well, have you got this out of your system now? Which I took as high praise indeed. In other words, she didn't think it was worth discussing, but she recognized that I had smashed them enough that anybody who still thought anarchism was worth talking about had to feel that this was the final refutation of it. So that one, she made that comment about, and she served for 2 years until she died. And and then Leonard Peikoff took over her role, but he didn't find any problem with what I was publishing either. And it was a joy to work with her, even when she thought things had to be rewritten. I could tell a longer story about the very first article I submitted, but I think I've taken enough time on this. Maybe some other Q&A. Is a role model, I think it should be, are a role model and a hero two separate categories of being that, while they may commonly overlap, are in themselves separate? A person can be a role model but never undergo a heroic endeavor. Yeah. And there's a novelist who specializes in almost heroic action, maybe heroic action by ordinary people whom you would call just decent folk. I don't know if you would call them role models, decent folk who rise to an occasion. And that's Neville Shute. Now, unfortunately, Neville Shute is best known for his worst book, which is On the Beach. But if you read Trustee from the Tool Room, or Requiem for a Wren, or The Far Country, or A Town Like Alice in particular, that's probably his best. You'll find this viewpoint, this benevolent viewpoint, that the ordinary, common, decent person has it within him, if the times call for it, to rise to a heroic endeavor and succeed. Yeah, role model is someone who is good and you want to be like. A hero is someone who's outstandingly, exceptionally good. And it's not, I wouldn't say he has to undergo a heroic endeavor, but he has to not betray the good in any way and be an outstanding representative of it, because he undergoes I guess it's a heroic endeavor, a trial, something that a lesser man would not rise to. So it's an issue of degree, both of them on the side of the good, and the hero is just phenomenally good morally. How do you know when you're rationalizing instead of actually thinking. How can you prevent it? Rationalization is an automatic response to the desire to do something that your reason knows you shouldn't do, or the desire not to do something that your reason knows you should do. So it's making up an excuse. It's making up an excuse that you know is phony, but it gets you to where your emotions want to take you. Like, it's all right to have this extra pie. It's not really breaking my diet because it's the weekend. I've heard that excuse given. Now, there's several important things to know about rationalization. One is that the thought occurring to you, well, it's the weekend, that's automatic. You shouldn't feel bad about yourself if an excuse pops up from the subconscious. All thoughts that come from the subconscious are automatic. They're not produced by your conscious deliberation. Your conscious deliberation is your purpose setting and your querying of your subconscious. But what you get back is not directly volitional. Now, indirectly over the years, how you organize your subconscious, how much you're in focus and how much you're not, how much you file things by essentials or don't, that's under your control, but that's a long-term thing. And if an excuse occurs to you, by all means, feel free to say, nah, I'm not responsible for that occurring to me. How do you detect an actual good reason? Like, it's okay to have this extra pie because I didn't have lunch today. Let's say that makes sense on your diet, versus it's okay to have the extra pie because it's the weekend. The rationalization, when it pops into your mind, has a bad odor. There's a sense that you have that this is not legit, that it does not compute. And that's why when people say it out loud, they often smile. Well, it's the weekend. There's a feeling that comes with the rationalization that it's a rationalization, that it isn't the God's honest truth, even though there's no God. It's a pretext, it's an excuse, it's an alibi, it's a phony thing. You smell the bad odor of the phoniness of it. And what your responsibility is to pay attention to that. Free will largely, I don't know if entirely, but largely comes down to paying attention to the signals you get from your subconscious. And one of them is, well, this isn't really honest. And you have to listen to that. And you have to say, well, is that really true? Does it really make a difference that it's a weekend? I mean, that feels like an excuse. And then you decide, and you might say, no, it came to me as a rationalization, but when I think about it, it's okay. I'm going to have the pie. How can you prevent it? I think by being alert to it and not going with the rationalization. Your subconscious over time gets a message and sends you fewer and fewer of them. But I don't think you'll ever be immune from the rationalization process because it comes from a limited context. Jean, my wife, has a very interesting new understanding of how emotions condition what context is activated. And if your emotions are saying pie, give me pie, and they don't mean the ratio of the circumference to the diameter, it's going to activate the context of reasons why you should have that pie and why it's not wrong to have that pie. And you have to step in and say, well, what are the reasons on the other side? Okay. And that's what rationality is. Rationality isn't ignoring your emotions. It's saying, okay, but what's the wider context? Your emotions are just your snap judgment. And you want to go by your considered judgment. If it's something of any significance whatsoever, there are little things we do all the time, like I'm going to scratch my head or something, where you don't need to question your motivation or, hold a little trial in your mind. But things beyond that, like having the extra pie or speaking sharply to your wife or husband, that needs the deliberate activation of the full context, not the partial context that your emotions are throwing up there at that moment. Can we say that the training of the ChatGPT model is induction and the use of the model to generate text is deduction? Yes and no. You put it in quotes. It's not induction, it's not deduction, because it's not a conscious process. Is it an analog to induction? No, except that it goes from cases to general tendencies. Insofar as it's a generalizing activity, it's generalizing. It's setting little, I can't think of the word, turning the dial to make it more likely that something will be the way it was in the past. So all so-called neural networks come down to is that the biasing factor, I think that's the right word, of various variables are set to increase to make something more likely if the input contains that connection. So that is not how induction works in man, and induction in man is the only induction there is. We get the principle. All that the ChatGPT is a statistician. It's saying, well, this happened a lot, it'll probably happen again. That is not induction. That is the wrong view of induction. But both that statistical approach and actual getting of principles do go from some to all. And the generation of text from what rules it's made up, what statistical biases it is formed, is like induction in that it is the application of something learned through the generalizations to a specific new case. So there's an analogy twice removed, but not so much to the induction side. And we have another, let me go to the other GPT question. What are your thoughts on OpenAI's newly released GPT-4 model? Didn't know about it. And its ability to process double the amount of context compared to its predecessor. I found that even 3.5, as opposed to 4, the earlier model, can process objectivist metaphysics and epistemology. Well, it can't. It can process words that people have generated on objectivist metaphysics and epistemology. So you have to know what these chatbots are actually doing. Their amazing achievement is to be able to compose grammatical English sentences. But in terms of how they get the content to put in those sentences, they just do searches. It's just when you're reading what ChatGPT has to say, it's just like reading what Wikipedia has to say or doing a Google search and getting an average of all the responses. So when it is asked a question about objectivist metaphysics and epistemology, it searches the web postings that are objectivist and looks for metaphysics, the word metaphysics. And it has in its database probably synonyms, ontology, and for epistemology, it has synonyms. It knows the kind of thing that's discussed in relation to any given term, that it's learned by the statistics of what's said in relation to it. So if there were a lot of enemies talking about objectivist epistemology, there are a few, but basically it's silence, then they wouldn't know what to do. They probably report, well, some people say this, some authorities say this, and some authorities say that. I've seen it do that. So it's nothing marvelous in the ability to be able to scrape websites and get data off the net. We all do that. So it's like a high school student researching some paper he's asked to write by looking on the web. What is marvelous is that it can make sophisticated grammatical prose out of it. And that is where the artificial intelligence, that is the statistical absorbing of how language is used, comes in. And that is, bowls me over. But the content, you could get that anywhere. Are you familiar with blindsight studies? A little. How can blindsight individuals detect motion and avoid obstacles without being consciously aware of them? I don't really know. I asked my old professor, I worked in this field of perception, visual perception, with one of the great professors in the field, Richard Held. He died recently. And at that time, which was about 15 years ago, I would say, I had a lunch with him. I worked with him in the mid-60s as an intern, just as an undergrad. I shouldn't say I worked with him. He told me what to do, and I did it. And it didn't work out real well, but I admire him a lot, and I was glad to have the opportunity to be in a lab where perception was being researched. But when I got, to be an adult, I got my PhD, I did work on perception from a philosophical standpoint, and I met with him. He said at that time, there are only about 2 of these cases of blindsight. So he didn't know how legitimate it was or wasn't. I take it from what I've seen, even by Richard Held on the web, that it's now more authenticated that it actually occurs. So how it occurs is the same way that skiing occurs or any skilled movement. That's something that one of my first psychology teachers said, we don't know how this happens, but you can automatize skilled movement, and that does not require conscious step-by-step supervision. A bunch of steps get put together, and how that translates into muscular performance, I don't think anyone actually knows, but you don't need moment-by-moment conscious supervision to do a lot of the physical actions that you do. Like you can walk and carry on a very demanding conversation. You couldn't do that when you were 2. Couldn't do either because you couldn't do a demanding conversation. But the brain has the ability, the brain is where automatized stuff goes. And there are 2 systems, there's a visual system for motion and there's a visual system for position. And I think for evolutionary reasons, they're in different brain centers and they have different means of operation. So probably one of them is knocked out and the other one isn't. So I don't really know. And I'm not sure anyone really knows, except that it's not anything totally jaw-dropping. It's an extension of skilled movement that occurs all the time. We're running out of speaking of time, and the next question I have is about infinite time. So let me see. Oh, and this is too juicy to do now. Okay, let me do this one, and they're 2 big questions that I'll put off to another session. That's the question about infinite time and how do I relate altruism, selflessness, and second-handedness. So they're being put off because they're too juicy to handle quickly in the time left. What tips would you give to help you detect, if you have not quite had the chance to think it through, when you're being altruistic or selfish? Two. One rational, or let us say one conceptual and one emotional. The first one is emotional. If you're being altruistic, you're dragging yourself to do, and I assume everyone knows here what altruism means. It means duty, self-sacrifice, putting yourself last and other people first, and it's bad. Selfish, in the objectivist sense, is living up to your full potential, living your life to the fullest while respecting the rights of others to do the same. When you're being altruistic, there's a gray spread of guilt over it. Well, I guess I have to do this. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be selfish. When you're being selfish, it's let me at them. I want, you don't have to urge me to eat the pie. I'm ready. I want the pie. Not eating the pie is not the best example of selfishness. You don't have to drag me to the computer to do a little program. You have to drag me away from the computer because I love doing that. So the first signal is it something you're making yourself do because you think well, you don't even know yet because you think you ought to, but you're making yourself do it? Or is it something you're eager to do? And then the second thing is why are you doing it? What is your purpose? Name your purpose. If you find that, I'm making myself do this, ask yourself, why? Why am I doing this? And if the answer comes back, well, he needs it, then first of all, don't just write that off. Ask yourself, well, am I acting as though his need was a claim on my life? Or what's going on here? If it's actually a value, why am I not eager to do it? And it can be lots of answers to that. Some that you would endorse, and some of you say, well, actually, now that I think of it, I'm not going to help him here. I'm not going to do this thing I'm supposed to do. Quote, supposed to do. So the two things are notice what you like doing, love doing, want to do, gladly do, and what you that's your tip off of thought needed, of name your purpose. Why are you doing it? Okay, I like doing this stuff. That's why we run over every time. This is not done to benefit you. This is done to benefit me because I like clarity. I love clarity. I lust for clarity. And the more I deal with issues, the clearer I get. And that's why I do it. Plus, they pay me. So this is not altruistic. This is selfish. And with that thought, I'll say goodbye until next week.